I'm Allan West, live in Ojai, California, and been retired for about 20 plus years from the U.S. Forest Service. I was Deputy Chief for State and Private Forestry in Washington, D.C., and in that position, all of protection, fire, insect disease, all relationships with states and with other countries as well, not international forestry, but relationships as it relates to sharing and cooperating. Yes, I was born in London in a hospital and raised there until about 1938. And then the family, just prior to World War II, moved to northern England, a community called Harrogate. The reason we did that, my father was a maitre d' on the Flying Scotsman, a famous train in England that ran from London to Edinburgh. And Harrogate was a stopping off point for it on its journey north. So Dad purchased a store, and my mother run that while my dad worked on the railroad. And soon World War II came, and Dad, of course, like all Britishers, joined the Air Force and got involved in that. After Harrogate and after the war, Dad purchased a hotel in York, one of the beautiful cities in northern England. And he, on the weekends, American servicemen came and that he'd had worked with, and they convinced him there was a better life in America. And so he put in for papers, found out we couldn't fit in the quota, so we went to Canada and stayed there about 2.5 years on our way to the United States. But I finished high school in Canada and met my future wife there. When I emigrated later to Canada, people couldn't understand me, and I had such a broad accent. They thought I was Scottish. And so most of my friends called me Scotty, including my future wife. Typical of my father, who really catered to some of the wealthy people, including the royal family in England. He found a ship that was making its maiden voyage, and it was called RMS Newfoundland, and all first class. He bought tickets for the family on that. We were only allowed to take certain things in the steam cabinets that we had. And middle of January, we headed across the Atlantic to Newfoundland and stayed there a couple of days while the ship got a second christening. And that's when I was introduced to horses pulling sleighs and ice, and tremendous ice on the ship when we got there. They had to use axes to open up the holds to get things out of it. And then after a couple of days, we hopped over to Halifax, and that's where we got a train to Toronto. Where we lived in Harrogate was a rural area, farms all around us. I loved to be amongst the chickens, and I liked to hike. Loved horses, and did everything I could to make money so I could afford to go horseback riding. And that's when I was introduced to scouting by friends and became very active in Boy Scouts. And of course, during the war, the Boy Scouts were very instrumental in salvaging paper, iron, and things like that to help the war effort. And I carried on scouting and elevated my ranks as I went in. And of course, when I left England, I thought, well, that's the end of it. But fortunately, I found a good friend that was in scouting, and they convinced me to continue my scouting. And I was able to complete my King Scout, which is like the Eagle, and then go one step beyond that, got what they call the Bushman Thong. And the Bushman Thong is somebody that goes out camping by themselves and lives off the land. And one of the things that Lord Baden-Powell insisted from his military life, that he wanted people that were tough, that could live off the land. In scouting, I had people that were mentors to me, and some of those were actual foresters with the University of Toronto graduates and professors. And I completed high school. I had been accepted at the University of Toronto in their forestry program when Dad made the decision to immigrate to the United States. But scouting had a big influence on my going to forestry, even though my dad didn't want me to. Although Dad did not want me to go into the hotel food business, and I didn't want to either. That's a 24/7 job, long nights. Dad rarely got home before 2 or 3 in the morning, and that wasn't the bad part. But you're inside. I wanted to be outside. I had a scoutmaster that was very encouraging, and I learned from him that you help people along the way, and you get gratification from helping others and seeing them advance. I still communicate with that scoutmaster, Bill Shaver, and his wife. If we go to Canada on a visit, we always see him, but we correspond at least once or twice a year. So important. Also, the people at Scout headquarters were mentors. For example, the big department store there was Simpsons and Eaton's. They had a Boy Scout shop there. Well, they chose me to be the model with the latest Boy Scout uniform. So I worked there on Saturdays and Sundays in the Boy Scout, and I was in their catalog, things like that. They encouraged me to do that, something I would never have done. So it kind of prepared me for working with people. Summertime in Canada, I was off camping as much as I could. The lakes in northern Ontario. There's one lake called Wingfoot Island, actually. It was owned by Goodyear Tires. And they had a camp set up there with a rustic log cabin. And I'd go up there for a couple of weeks and help as Boy Scout troops came through there and had their camp. So again, through the mentoring of my scouting elders, I was able to do these kind of things. As I said, I was a Boy Scout in Canada, and she was a Girl Guide. That's like Girl Scouts in Canada. And at the school where we had our meetings, the Scouts were in the basement and the girls had their meeting upstairs. And every once in a while we'd do things together. And one get-together was square dancing, learning how to square dance. And so we had this square dancer, caller, and so forth. And they said, well, now it's time to pair up, so everybody paired up. I didn't know what to do. I was just, I never heard of square dancing. So anyway, there was Joyce all by herself and me, and I looked around and said, I guess I'm stuck with you, in a broad accent. And so that was the beginning of romance. After I emigrated, after a year, I came back for a couple of weeks on the Greyhound bus from Toronto, from Long Beach to Toronto, and proposed to her and got her father's blessings, and that's why the next year she came down and we got married. So now, 63 years later, we're still happily married. Well, in Canada, to go to college, you go through grade 13. You go to a matriculation school. You could have gone to a vocational school, but I went to matriculation. I came down when the family immigrated to the United States in 1952. The destination was Long Beach, because that's where our sponsor was. Not knowing I was the first person to go to college in the family, we didn't know the ins and outs. We didn't know about scholarships or anything like that. So I went to Long Beach City College for 2 years, took 20 units each semester, and got everything out of the way before transferring to Berkeley. Long Beach City College was very good. I got my basic things out of the way. You have to do Spanish, you have to do American history, which I didn't know anything about. But I got in a lot of science. I had to retake a number of things. I'd had statistics and economics, advanced algebra, analytic geometry. I had all that in high school, but the requirements in California to get into Berkeley, we had to take those. So that's why I took about 22 units a semester while I was there, to get that out of the way. But what I really liked was the field trips in botany, plant identification, what we call taxonomy. I collected in that semester about 500 plants for California's flowers that were all pressed and mounted. In fact, I don't have the plants, they were lost, but I still have the book describing all of those plants today. So Long Beach City College was a good experience for me. And then Berkeley, one of the requirements is before you become a junior, you have to go to in those days, a 9-week forestry camp. And that camp at Camp Meadows near Quincy, California. And that's when I really got introduced to what forestry is all about. And met people, my classmates, small class, about 20, that we still communicate today, and have been life friends since then. When I came back from camp, came back to Long Beach the end of August, and Joyce in the meantime had emigrated from Canada and was with my folks, so we could get married. And so we were married early September, and then off to Berkeley we went. The honeymoon was on the way to Berkeley, pulling our worldly goods in a trailer behind us, and then started school. I was just fascinated by what I've got myself in for. My father wasn't so sure. He and Joyce, my wife, saw the movie Red Skies Over Montana and scared the devil out of him that this is what my life was going to be. And I assured them that's just one little part of forestry. It wasn't about fires and people losing their life in fires and jumping out of planes and so forth. So they were satisfied. And then Father actually encouraged me to be a forester, and so I had his blessings also. I had some great professors at Berkeley. Professor Ed Stone was one of them who kind of helped me through. John Zibanuska, I didn't like or understand economics, but he helped me through. But I went through and continued on into graduate school there. Was president of the forestry club that we had, a very active club, doing projects in the community and on campus. And I also played varsity soccer for the University of California for 3 years, and also for 1 year played semi-pro in city of San Francisco. So Berkeley was a great time for us. I couldn't get a job because I wasn't a citizen, and so I worked for the California Alumni Association in the summers at their summer camp, and was the naturalist for the Cal Berkeley, the lair of the golden bear at Pinecrest. My wife, by the way, she had a job with the Alumni Association, and so she was the secretary to the director of the camp and one other gentleman, Cliff Doctorman. But we're lifelong friends with both of those, although now Mike Cole, the director of operations of the camp, he has passed away, but we still keep in touch with his wife. But that's in the summertime we were able to do that, and although it wasn't forestry, it was out in the forest, sharing what I had learned to some of the general public. In Berkeley, I made the Honor Society too, Alpha Zeta, the Agriculture Honor Society, and Xi Sigma Pi, the Forestry Honor Society. That's right. That's an interesting matter that I wanted to. We were talked about that both at summer camp and when you're your first year in school. So I applied, and my application was returned and said you can't become a member. And so again, that was incentive for me to get my citizen as soon as I could. And that's what happened. I got my citizenship in the minimum time allowed, 5 years after you arrive, plus 1 month. And I'd gone through all the tests and the judge briefings and so forth. And I was sworn in with support from the Forest Service because they needed people to work for them. To get my citizenship, again, I had a good tutor, somebody that worked for the Forest Service that kind of took me under the wings. And one summer, while Joyce was at the camp during the summer and I didn't go up there, this individual, Tom Pagenhut, he was a geographer, and took me through the process of what I needed, so I was all primed for the time I got my citizenship. So that was, again, very important. Also, there were some people in the Forest Service, even though I couldn't work for them, they made a way that I could by passing money through to the university. And so they had me working with a Dr. Murov, a Russian scientist that came to this country, who took a liking to me and he wanted me into the laboratory, and I was doing research on pine pollen of all things. And so that was the start of being introduced to the Forest Service. And upon graduation, I guess I'd been seen by other people in research, and I'd started to take some courses in forest influences of hydrology with Paul Zinke, another one of my mentors, a professor there. And Paul and I got along very well, and he encouraged me to move in that direction into the watershed management field. When I got my master's degree, I had people, universities offering me jobs. There was a period of shortage of scientists and so forth. And so I had opportunities. And what happened was the Forest Service research station in Berkeley, at that time, the California Forest and Ranger Experiment Station, had a research program on snow, and they asked me if I would like to take a job there. And I said I'd love to, but until I get my citizenship, I can't. So again, they worked out something where the University of California hired me, and they hired me back, you might say. It was a way I could go up, and I went right out of graduation to Donna Summit in August of that year, 1957. And so we found a ski cabin up there. Joyce was pregnant at that time with our first son, and we were there until it was time for me to get my citizenship. I came down for the swearing in, and Joyce came, and we went back after becoming a citizenship. The next day, our son was born several weeks premature with the stress of going down there. So we had new citizenship. I was hired by the Forest Service, and a new son, all in a matter of a week or two in that place. Donna Summit was an interesting place, and it was once a Corps of Engineers research station, known for its deep snow, and that winter the total snowfall was different from the way most people measure it, but when it snows you have a board and you keep moving it up, so you keep measuring the snow. But that winter, by the end of April of 1958, we had 960 inches of snow. And Joyce, of course, was isolated back in there with a brand new baby. We had caves dug to get out of the houses and the research station. But it was a great experience. And there you're a weather station. When it's snowing, you're up 24 hours measuring the snow. I remember one storm that we had 16 feet in one storm. So for me, I finally, I'm out in the outdoors enjoying it. I had crews of aides that helped me. I had one other scientist there with me who went back to school and got his doctorate degree. So that was the beginning of my research time, and I did that for about 8 years. Right on Highway 40 in those days, that was before the new interstate came through there, we had a garage, and that's where we kept our personal vehicles, and we didn't have government vehicles. And then we have these large Tucker snowcats, like they had in the Arctic, and also what we call weasels. They were a military vehicle that went over the snow, both of them tracked. So we used those to get from the garages up to our home and to the snow laboratory, about a mile from the highway. And if you can imagine that highway, it would be a tunnel with snow 8-10 feet as they drove through there, and it carved it and blown the snow and so forth. At the snow laboratory and at our house, you had stories, and the snow lab was 3 stories high with a peaked roof, and you couldn't see it if you drive over it. So the snow compacts, and so we cut from the entrance to the snow lab caves to get out so you could get up to the top. Same with the house. The upper balcony, you kind of made a little cave to get out to the top of the snow, and as it settled, we redo it and so forth. So an interesting time, especially for a wife with a brand new baby. But you always can improvise. The young son became very ill while we were in one of those snowstorms. The highways were closed. Working through the radio system, and then we had a crank telephone also. We were able to get hold of our doctor in Truckee. And the railroad actually brought him up on an engine to Soda Springs, where the snow lab is. I picked him up in the snowcat and brought him up so he could treat the boy. So all sorts of interesting experience can happen in that. But it was, I wrote a number of papers. I was studying the influence of forest on snow. How do you manage the forest to maximize the amount of water that comes off of the snow shed? And so if you harvest the trees in such a way, then you get the eddying effect that puts more snow into the opening and less on the trees. You can also orient them the right way so you get less evaporation and more melting. So I wrote a number of articles, one of them in the Journal of Forestry, at least one, on that process and so forth. After several years, the research station wanted me to get my PhD, and they sent me back to Berkeley for a year in the time I was doing it. And I got some classes out of the way. I went back to the snow lab, and then I had been accepted at Colorado State to finish my PhD. But I decided really that wasn't what I wanted to do. I really wanted to be a forester that managed the land. And so that's when I decided to switch direction in my career. Again, working with mentors and people that had helped me along the way. One of them was Charlie Connaughton, the regional forester in those days. Another one was Walt Hopkins, a wonderful gentleman who was indirectly my boss in Berkeley. And they worked out a deal where I could go from research into the National Forest. And but I'd been out for a long time and had risen to a certain point, and I didn't have the experience to take on a significant job. So they assigned me to a ranger district, which is Levining, and the ranger was somebody I knew from the summer work I had done with the University of California camp. So that was Jack Reveal. Jack was a wonderful man who really ought to have been a Renaissance man. He was an artist, he was an author, an archaeologist. He did everything. In fact, he was so well known on his other things. He had Dr. Leakey, famed for the early man in Africa, come and visit us with about 80 colleagues while I was assistant ranger there. So fascinating things that happened along the way, and he helped me, prepared me to become a district ranger is what he did. After 2 years at Levining, I was given the dream job for a forester. When you're in forestry school, you always think, I want to be a district ranger. And so I was assigned to Ojai. I had no idea where Ojai was or what it was about. Joyce was a little worried because after 2 assignments of isolation, you might say, because Levining was fairly isolated. It's on the backside of Yosemite, and that road was closed all winter long. We came to Ojai, and we just fell in love with it. And it's just beautiful valley, and was assigned here about 300,000 acres of well known in the history for its fires of the past and so forth. So I was ranger for 5 years, and it was here that I really learned how to manage and get involved. I was very close with the Congressman Teague, and later on Congressman Lagomasino. I was almost treated like the second mayor of Ojai. The forest was so important to them. And when we had fire, I utilized the people in Ojai. If we needed sandwiches, we went to the local restaurant and got it. When we wanted groceries for fire camp, we got them locally. And people liked that. And I worked with the city council, and cooperation and involvement were so important to me that I'd learned along the way that I think the people of Ojai appreciated that. And we also got involved in the community, got involved in our church and so forth. We had conflict with with people when they wanted to mine for uranium, or they would mine for phosphate, the oil developments and so forth. But I always found that if you're open and tell them exactly what you're doing and invite them in, even though they may not like what you're doing, they can respect you for what you did. I found that I could work with the locals when they kicked it up to their major organizations in Washington, D.C. is where it got out of my hands. But those people, those organizations, all were there when I needed somebody to back me up. And when I went away, for example, when I was promoted, they were all there for my going away party. And I think that was out of true respect rather than a good riddance. Well, I think my time in Fresno was fairly short-lived. At Fresno was 5 years, I should say, as a deputy. Again, a great mentor with Sotero Muniz, who was the forest supervisor. Again, lifelong friend. In fact, we always called one another brothers. We were very close, and the families were very close. That was the forest that you dream about being so well balanced. Had timber, had recreation, wildlife, snow, ski area, just about everything. Water, reservoirs, so forth. So anyway, I had a tremendous experience in Fresno. Coming down and being offered the forest supervisor job of the Los Padres, again, that was a dream I never thought would happen. I thought, well, here's where I can live the rest of my life and so forth. And Fresno is such a beautiful community to live in. Very difficult for us to manage when you see how long it is from Monterey to Interstate 5 and to about 2 million acres. Some beautiful wilderness area. The time I was forest supervisor, over 70% of it was roadless. And that made it very difficult, of course, for firefighting and so forth. And we had a number of major fires while I was forest supervisor. One of them being the Marble Cone fire that was up in Monterey. And that fire seemed to go on and on forever and had the potential of burning into Carmel. So, very serious fire. It's also around a military base up there called Fort Hunter Liggett. And that base is a training base for the military, and they got tanks and so forth running around, and they're remote controlled. And we didn't know that, but when we were fighting the fire and we were trying to downlink photos of the fires to the fire camp, it was jamming the signals of the tanks that were running around. And I remember a call from the general asking me what we were doing. They can't stop the tanks to go where they wanted them to go. Anyway, we figured it out to do it. But those are the kind of interesting issues that come. Again, though, there was a case where we had tremendous support. California Department of Forestry, the local fire departments, and then following the fire, the restoration of that area with in those days, the Soil Conservation District and the local people and so forth. We had great support. And I had a ranger up there who understood how to restore an area after a burn. He had a degree in hydrology, and that was Bob Brazil. Yeah, if I remember, we were just experimenting with the infrared being downlinked to the fire camp on that fire. Prior to that time, they'd fly the fire and then land and then deliver by ground the infrared fire outline. Very important when you're making plans and decisions. But at the end of my career on the Los Padres, I was asked to move to Washington, D.C. And the regional forester at that time was had been, during the fire, Doug Leitz. And Doug was way ahead in thinking about what's needed. He had gone to Washington and was associate chief. And he wanted to bring the Forest Service up into the technological era. And one of the things he wanted to do was make sure that every ranger had a computer on his desk so he can communicate. At that time, we had no way to communicate between rangers, the regional office, the Washington office. And my job was to set up a new staff called the Director of Data Management, and with two other staff directors, one in hardware and one in software, and myself, the information side. It was our job to figure out what we were going to do to put a computer on everybody's desk. And the old timers will all remember the era of the data management, data general. And we ended up after a couple of years of every ranger having a computer on it as desk. Now, my role was, if you're not careful, the hardware and the computer specialist dictate what should go on. My job was to bring what data is the ranger, what he really needs. And it's such a key thing, and that's what Doug Leach thought through and why he asked me to come into that job. The position when I came had all specialists in it, but nobody that had the ground experience of what they need to fight a fire, to make a special use permit, and so forth. So I brought into Washington a couple of district rangers, and then with my own background, we set the standards for what they needed in terms of information. And I think based on Doug's foresight, that started the Forest Service on an accelerated rate of getting computerized through the agency, and it continues today. I'm very strong for an agency. In fact, I really didn't want to go. I had one son in college out here at Berkeley, and then I had two other sons, one of them just completing high school, and then I had one that's much younger. I really thought that, hey, that isn't what I want, but there were indications, well, do your duty and go back there, and then you'll come back out to the field again in another position if you do your job right. And so I've always listened to what the people above me have recommended for me. Nobody ever steered me wrong, and so I willingly went back there, and they were willing to take me with the limited knowledge I have about computers, and so that's what I did. The family wasn't sure, but they loved it back there. In fact, when it was time to retire, my wife wondered why were we going back and leaving Washington. She had become so involved in it. So it was a shock, but I was only in that job of data management for a little over 2 years when the National Fire Director job came open. And so I was named Director of Aviation and Fire Management. When I started out, it was the Director of Fire Management, and then changed to Aviation and Fire Management. And I did that for a little over a year and a half when another position came up. But in that time I was Fire Director. It really was a job. If I ever had one I really liked to specialize in, that was the job. And I thought I could contribute. I had a lot of knowledge in it, fought a lot of fires, and I liked being around the fire community. Took a trip to Australia, sharing technology with other fire specialists for a couple of months in that. Spain, went there and shared our technologies with them, as well as being involved in major fires. And then I was asked to be Associate Deputy Chief for Programs and Legislation. And in that job I was associate to the deputy, and we were charged with the budget, the long-range planning, when there was this called the RPA, Resources Planning Act documents, and then the other legislative things. When legislation is proposed, the analysis of it, any testimony that we had to give, prepare that so that it can be approved and then given by somebody in the top group of the Forest Service. And that was a good job. I worked for another individual that brought me along because I didn't have the knowledge, Lamar Beasley, very close to Lamar today. He helped me through that, and we became a real team and had a real team in the various staffs that worked there. And then after about 3.5 years in that job, was offered the job of Deputy Chief for State and Private Forestry. There, all of the things came together. It was working with others, cooperators, the state foresters, a lot of international contacts, North American Forestry Commission, which is a part of the FAO, United Nations Forestry Group, the Mexico, Canada, and the US that meet to share our technologies and help one another. So all of those things, and the Forest Service made the decision to bring fire and aviation under that group. Insect and diseases was already there. The work of the actual doing, not the research on it, but the actual mapping of conditions and actual the applications if they needed it. So it was a big job. When I was there, we also brought in the Native American group, and I brought in a group leader that helped, that brought all of those relationships under that staff, and finally brought in such things as the information, education kind of things, not the public relations, but the education part of it, because that was such a big part of the state foresters programs. So that job I did for 8 years. Again, a lot of international travel in many countries, including Japan and South America and Europe and so forth. In all of those cases, I was interacting with other foresters, and they were so thrilled to have the United States sharing our technologies with them. A lot of my trips were with fire, because that's where my expertise were. But for example, when I went to Australia, we brought back that there's a need for them to use some of our specialists when they have their fire season. that is the opposite to ours. And how do we do that? And then if we send air tankers down there, how do we do that? And there were laws on the book that prohibited that. And so we suggested legislation to change that so that we could charge them and they could charge us, and it would be done legally according to the statutes. So things like that make you feel very good about your interaction with other countries. On the other hand, they would come over here, and when they came over here, we're a family that always entertains people, loved it. So we always had the international visitors feed us, come and have a meal with us, and so forth, and invite other people from the Forest Service. So it was a really nice relationship with the international visitors. You know, one of the things that's fascinating when you're a deputy chief, there are things that you can do based on what your staff brings to you. And your staff, the staff brought to me the concern over the wildland urban interface, where houses are built right up against the brush. Something we've talked about in Southern California for forever, but we didn't have some specific programs. Insurance companies are not involved, and so forth. And so through my position, I was able to work with the president of the National Fire Protection Association out of Boston, the outfit that has been setting standards for fires through the United States forever. And we partnered together and had a big program called Wildfire Strikes Home. And that grew and grew, and of course it's now fully integrated and so forth. It grew not only in the United States, but internationally. And we had a big international symposium on the subject in Boston. And then I was asked to travel to France and lecture on it and the laws at the University of Aix-en-Provence in France. But those kind of things your people bring to you, and you get to carry them out. The same with the program about Smokey Bear and Smokey and the Pros. A young fella that was actually right here in Ojai, Punky McClellan, a fire prevention technician, he always thought that if you tie Smokey to some thing that the families do, like baseball, what a wonderful way to get the message of preventing forest fires around. And so he brought to me a program where we partner with American baseball. And I was able to establish a meeting with the commissioner of baseball, and at the time it was Mr. Uberoth, who was acting director of Major League Baseball, presented it to him, and he bought the idea. And that grew in that every Major League Baseball team would have a Smokey Bear Day. And Smokey would be there. We would have baseball cards with a Smokey message on one side and baseball players on the other side. That became so popular. Oh, and Smokey would throw out the first ball at them. Fortunately, I was able to go to most baseball games for over about a 3-year period and throw out the first ball with Smokey. But that grew in where it became Smokey and the pros, because it went into football, went into college sports, rodeo, and so forth. So an idea that one of your people came up through, you were able to instrumental in getting it implemented, and you know, that's one of the joys of job. Doesn't sound like forestry, but it sure is in what it was doing. Well, as deputy chief and being responsible for fire, the federal government in Washington has disaster groups that meet, the high-level people, because when there's a disaster, they want to have the top people that can respond, and who can respond better than the fire agencies. And even though I'm talking about the Forest Service, you have the fire agencies like the Department of Interior, all the state forestry agencies, and so forth. So I sat in all of those discussions prior to and when a disaster strikes. When the Loma Prieta earthquake hit, 2 weeks before, we'd had a drill out in Sacramento of how we would respond if there was a major earthquake out here, just to see how we coordinate and so forth. When it hit, it was in the middle of a state foresters annual meeting in San Antonio, and I remember an emergency call coming through while I was, it was at dinner time, when they wanted me to get on the phone and be able to respond to them on disaster things. And the waiter, one of the people from the hotel, ran up and down the Riverwalk trying to find out which restaurant I was in for dinner to bring me back for the emergency call. This was before cell phones and so forth, or they weren't that popular in those days. Anyway, it turned out that I just needed to activate the response of the Interagency Fire Center out of Boise to let specialists go out there with the instant command teams to go out there. But it's things like that that the agency was involved in. And I don't want to make it sound like it's just the Forest Service, but we were at the hub of it. The Challenger, when it went down, when certain big floods occur, organizing groups, that's what we're good at. And we can also find workers readily in fire crews if they're not. And it's all organized in advance so that they can when local forces are overloaded. Okay, well, under the FAO, a part of the UN, for forestry, the FAO deals with agriculture, forestry, and so forth. Then around the world, they have got segments of commissions, forestry commissions. And one of those is the North American Commission, which is Mexico. And as it related to fire, the North American Forestry Commission, I chaired that, where we met at least once a year in one country or the other. And in the meantime, we exchanged documents and papers. And then when one of us had an issue, we needed additional resources in terms of fire, then we had a way of asking and receiving those. And that's the way we cooperated fire-wise between Canada and North America, the United States, and also Mexico. It's much more sophisticated now than what it was when I was chair. But we had some wonderful meetings, and certain things came from those meetings that we were able to get Congress to go along with. Well, they did use different technologies and so forth. One thing you hear about is for prescribed burning, the use of a helitorch. That's where they, with a helicopter, you have burning material dropped aerially. Well, that came from Australia and New Zealand, and then brought to this country, and then gave to some use. Other countries use dynamite to make fire lines, and we've utilized that too, but it doesn't fit in all situations. And so those kind of things, they come, we try them, and move from there. Some of the concepts of the urban wildland interface, where there are subdivisions right in the brush, right up against the forest. The concept of roads that aren't one way in, they're circular roads, so there's more than one exit. They didn't do that in Australia. And of course, in this country, we've got rules that you've got to have a one way in and one way out, primarily so that when the fire trucks are coming in and other resources, they're not fighting the people trying to get out. So little things, but made big things when a major incident occurs. Right. That was quite a year in terms of fires. 1987, the Yellowstone fires burned for months, and I mean months. Started in the forests, some of them did. Extreme drought conditions, a lot of lightning, and so fires started in many different places. It was big news, and the president was getting battered by the media about all these fires and what are you doing to stop them. And it was the Park Service policy at that time to let some of those fires burn and not take suppression action. And of course, this riled up people with the media saying, oh, we're going to lose the Yellowstone Lodge, or we're going to damage the park for 100 years and couldn't be used. You also had all the concessionaires around Yellowstone whose livelihood was really based on all the tourism. And of course, with the fires, they had no tourists, no business. So a lot of controversy over it. And finally, the president asked the Secretary of Agriculture to form a team with the Secretary of Interior and Defense and go out there and find out what's really going on and report back to him. And so I got a call from the Secretary to come over and brief him on the fire. I had been out there in my responsibility as Deputy Chief to look at the fires, not in the park, but in the National Forest on the outside. Some of the teams that were fighting fire in the parks were headed by Forest Service employees. So there was a big involvement in it. And so after I briefed the Secretary, we went to Andrews Air Force Base and got into one of the presidential jets, not the big ones, and flew out there, the 3 secretaries and a couple of generals were with us because we knew we were going to be looking on asking for troops. And we landed in Jackson Hole, and then were driven with a motorcade. People were up in arms. They were very upset, and placards and demonstrate, so forth. So we actually had law enforcement escorting us into it. Went into public meetings with the senators there, and of course again the media was all over them. It really was a very difficult time because from my perspective in what I did in terms of fire management, is under drought conditions that we had, I would never have just let fires burn. Fires get to a certain size and there's nothing you can do about it. And so, but that was their policy, and that's what it wouldn't do. So my recommendation is that, we needed to change the policy as to when you let fires burn and when you didn't. And even though there are certain fires today that we want to burn, there's a lot of them that need to be put out when you have the kind of weather conditions we had that year. Following the trip and report back, I formed a team, and we had a team go around the entire country. It took a year, and did an analysis of the Firestone fires. And even though I say Yellowstone, there were other fires all around the perimeter, and do an analysis, get people's input at public meetings, and then came to some conclusions as to what the policies would be from there on. So it was a big impact on me personally, also on the Forest Service, how we dealt with things, and from it came some clear-cut guidelines as to what you do during extreme conditions and fires. Now, unfortunately, since the Yellowstone fire, we've had some of the largest wildland fires that we've had in this country, and part of that is because of dead and dying trees from bark beetles and so forth. But that's another story that deals with management of the forest and the ability of them to sustain without having fire. So you've got some conflict in whether man can help that by harvesting some of them in some way, but somehow we need to do a better job of managing the fires, rather than managing the forest. Well, I think foresters, and you go all the way back to Gifford Pinchot, his whole concept was to manage the forest using scientific principles. And foresters know how to manage the forest. We know how to do that. Now, some people feel you don't need to manage them, just let them grow the way they had in times of history, and everything be fine. That, of course, includes fires going through them and thinning the forest and so forth. Well, that works in some places, but we know it doesn't work when you've got large populations visiting the forest and also living in and adjacent to the forest. Also, timber is a valuable resource. It's a valuable resource to country and to the communities where it is, and it can be utilized. And by managed forests and utilizing it, you can also act very similar to what naturally nature has done. So with us reducing the amount of harvesting of trees, managing the forest, then you've got forests that are overcrowded, they're weak, there's too many trees per acre, so when there's not enough water to sustain them, and as a result you get insects like the bark beetle attacking them, putting their eggs into the trees, and then their larvae girdling them, and then the trees dying, and that just expands and expands. And then of course, once you've got all these dead trees and we have a fire, even if you try to put it out, it's almost impossible to. So I'm hopeful that with some mitigation in how some of our environmental laws are written, we can get back to the scientific management of the forest, so we can bring them back into a balance that we can keep fires at a level that is reasonable. You know, one thing I just mentioned while I was forest supervisor of the Los Padres, there was another fire here that in a place that's well known to the people, and that was Vandenberg. And that's where the missile site is, at Vandenberg. And I happened to be forest supervisor when a major fire broke out there at the missile range. And it's a typical Air Force base. It has lots of homes and everything else, but there's also brush like you have in the Los Padres. And so the fire started, it was heading towards the community, heading towards the site, and the general in charge and the fire chief went out ahead to investigate, even though they had crews from the base trying to put it out or to contain it. And they, not being well knowledgeable about wildland fires, they got caught in the fire, and both of them were killed by the fire. So here's the base, lost its general and the fire chief. And I remember getting a call close to midnight telling me that they need help, and can I come to the base? And so I went out there with my people and so forth, and brought other people in, just as if we were fighting fire in the forest. But following that, the new general asked us to come up and have a forum with them and talk to them. What is it they really ought to be doing in fuel mitigation, fuel breaks, and that kind of thing? And so we worked with the Air Force to develop a plan for that. Now, the importance of this is, it doesn't matter who you are, you offer your help and assistance to your neighbors to help them out. And I found that doing that, you know, everybody benefits. And I know the Air Force benefited from that and strengthened their fire organization, got the right equipment, and also put people knowledgeable about how to manage the brush for future fires. And to my knowledge, they haven't had a major fire since that time. You know, it's nice to get recognized for what you do, and a lot of that is related to some of the stories that I've already relayed to, such as the notorious federal executive. That came after the Yellowstone fires, but where I was able to do that and was honored by the president for that, which is done annually for the executives. Some of the other awards is really what you do outside the job. Volunteerism. You don't only work, but you give back to the community. So being an Ojai Living Treasure is something voted on by the people of Ojai for your contributions in the community, whether it's with the school district, whether it's with career days, your church, a number of things that they've recognized that was a help to develop the community. So both Joyce and I have been named living treasures, and we'll continue to volunteer as long as we can. So again, a lot of people have helped me. It's now time for me to do something to help others, especially the young people. I've talked about mentoring. It so important, and I feel that was a strong part in why I was able to rise through the ranks and do what I love to do. And so I want to help others maybe do the same thing through their careers. Well, first of all is remember, not every job is ideal or what you thought it was going to be. So you do your job, but then you do that little bit extra, and also continue to learn, ask questions, and go beyond. The other thing is get involved in your profession. A big asset to me was being a member of the Society of American Foresters, and I was on the policy committee for SAF at the national level. I co-chaired a national meeting in Washington, D.C., and always active when I was in California with the Northern and Southern Societies of American Forestry. So, not so many of our young professionals think this is important. But if you have aspirations and you really want to make a difference, you need to be involved and give in terms of volunteering to your profession and to help others. I think it's so important that not everything. I know today people are concerned about their families, and they need time to be with their family. I think Joyce and I have done a good job there. I've got two sons that are foresters, one that was an environmental engineer. So we were able to manage the family, the helping others, and do the job also. So that's what I would tell a young professional coming. It was at the Snow Laboratory that I went to my first SAF meeting, annual meeting. The National Forest where the Snow Lab was located, they kind of took us under their wing. So I was introduced to the SAF chapters, the Northern California, and of course I was a member now, and I became active in that. But the very first annual meeting was in Salt Lake City, and I remember one of the assistant directors and his wife drove up from Berkeley and picked me up and took me to the meeting, and that really opened my eyes as the value of meeting other professionals and why it was important to get involved in your professional society. There's no doubt that being a member of your profession is really important to you as a professional. You got to keep up to date on what's going on, what the changes are. Even though I'm in a little bit of an isolated place right now, I read the Journal of Forestry, Forestry Source, and I get to most of the national meetings. It's a little more difficult for me to get to the sections, Northern or Southern California. But when I was working, I did that and did it faithfully and also contributed, whether it was being vice chair or chair-elect or a committee chair or helping with a meeting of some kind. It just strengthens your ability and also opens doors to people you get to know. I'm sure many of the mentors that I had through my career came via my meeting them once or twice in advance at a professional meeting. So there are all sorts of opportunities like that for young professionals. My vision is really a forest like the Sierra National Forest, where you've got timber that's green and healthy, it's producing, and it's producing economically. It's providing adequate runoff with limited soil movement. You've got an abundance of wildlife in it, and you've got opportunities for untold opportunities for recreation, whether it's hiking or skiing or what have you. To me, when I got transferred to the Sierra and saw that, it was what I visioned as the ideal. Now, I'm not saying that the Los Padres isn't like that, but it's a different kind of forest, and all kinds are needed. The Los Padres, with its brush rather than its trees, is still a very important part of the state of California. But an ideal forest to me is something like in the Central Sierras. No, other than I appreciate the society doing these oral interviews. I think that they're important, even though some of my experiences will not be applicable in the future. Just the idea about what it was like, and there may be some lessons to learn into the future based on mine and the other oral interviews that you're taking. If you don't, it's lost forever.